Hello, in this video we're going to be looking at pigments part 2, so let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now when we're talking about the pigments that are involved in photosynthesis, again we want to remind you that for chlorophylls there are many types. But only A and B are used in plants. Again, that's the diagram that we saw in the last video of the absorption spectrum, the absorption range for chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and the B keratin. Now, chlorophyll A, as I mentioned, is the main pigment used in plants and cyanobacteria. It's the only one that can do both absorb, convert the light to chemical energy. So that's why it's around the electron in the photosystems of the LDR, the light dependent reaction, and it absorbs those violets and blues and the reds. And again, it's the solid line in the graph. The chlorophyll B, as I mentioned in the last video, it's an accessory pigment along with the B keratin. It simply is just picking up different other energies that the A's cannot. It's not that they don't want to, it's just they're not part of their absorption spectrum. The B absorption spectrum is, again, as I mentioned, on the left side of the graph, it's just inside of that. And on the right side of the graph, it's inside of that. So its main areas are within the outer edges of the chlorophyll A. Now, when we're talking about the carotids, they're pretty complex molecules, as you can see in the diagram over there. They're simply, you can see the carbon hexagram over there, and then you see just a string of alternating bonds between singles, which is shown by the one line, or the double bond, which is shown by the two lines. Just a long series string of those bonds. But keratins, again, super important for the reason I mentioned earlier about the variations in colors, the reds and the oranges and the yellows and the purple flowers. That's based on keratins. And again, it's an inverse relationship, because if the flower petal is purple, what that means is that it's absorbing everything else other than those high energy violets at the very far left of that gradient to that spectrum. Or like on a tomato that's red, that means the keratins are in there, are absorbing everything except for the reds. If the flower is I don't know, blue. I just used blue as an example, so I'll just move on. But those colors are super important because that's what brings in the needed insects or animals for the plants. If you think about the colors, is what brings in the pollinators. Of course, it's also the aroma as well. But bringing in those pollinators to get that process started of developing a new fruit, new seeds, and of course the fruit dispersers, which is a fancy way of saying an animal will come in and eat the fruit and therefore digest the seed, and then of course at a later time, not to be too graphic, but eventually the seed is put back on the ground with a nice little fertilizer to start that growth, start that development process. If you think about a horse that comes along and eats an apple, and it'll digest the apple, but the seeds, no. They will simply pass through the digestive system and eventually, as I mentioned, be put back on the ground, ready to germinate, of course, in a nice pile of fertilizer as well. So those keratins are pretty important. Accessory pigment, yes, but super important. And last thing I mentioned earlier, they are also important because they have a very wide range of absorbing energy. You saw the spikes on the B keratin, which really wasn't super wide, but others are much wider. And of course, the chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B have a pretty set range. But if you're gonna make a tomato red because you absorb everything else but the red, that's a pretty wide range. I mean, that's 95% of the spectrum. So keratins are important in that fact. They have that wide range. Alright, so that was our video over pigments, part 2. When we come back together next time, we're going to start looking at the structures of the LDR, the light dependent reaction, and the Calvin cycle. So we'll see you then.